Hello, good evening. Welcome to Listen, Learn, and Love, a seminar on how to disagree well in a polarized world from St. Mark's Episcopal Church in New Canaan, Connecticut. I'm Father Justin Crisp. I'm one of the associate rectors and the theologian in residence at St. Mark's, and I'm delighted to be your host this evening. Just a few notes about what's coming here. Our time together this evening is divided into two portions. The first part of our time will be a presentation, and then it will be followed by Q&A, and just a word about each in turn. So during the presentation, Dr. Bickel will actually be able to take input from you all who are watching either on Facebook Live or here on Zoom through a website called menti.com. And for those of you in Zoom, I'm putting the information in the chat box here. All that you do is you go to menti.com and you plug in a presentation code, which is 4706130. I'll say that one more time if you're on Facebook Live, 4706130. If you were registered for this through St. Mark's website, you also received a hyperlink that you can just click and go to that Menti presentation. Sometimes it's easier to pull that Menti presentation up on a second device like a smartphone or an iPad. And there you can follow along with the PowerPoint. You'll also be able to do so by following along here on Zoom or Facebook Live. But if you follow along on the Menti website, then you can actually take polls that Jewelle is going to run. We'll be able to see those results live. A word about the FAQ. You'll see here that I've got Zoom set up to where everybody is muted unless I ask you to unmute. That's simply to keep our time moving well. Please use the raise your hand function in Zoom if you would like to speak, and I'll invite you to unmute if you'd like to say a word here publicly. You can find the raise your hand function in Zoom under the participants window on a computer or your iPad. Okay, so you click participants and you'll find the option, the button there to raise your hand. I'll call on you, invite you to unmute, and you can ask your question to Dr. Bickel that way. You may also feel free to ask questions of Dr. Bickel in the chat or by leaving a comment on the Facebook broadcast. Either way will be fine, and I'll keep track of those. We'll have about 15 minutes for questions at the end of our class this evening. So this is the first of 4 sessions this week and each of the subsequent 3 Tuesday evenings. Thank you very much for your flexibility last week as we had to reschedule that first session for this week, and we just shifted the program a week here. More information with the calendar, full calendar of these classes can be found on our website, stmarksnewcanaan.org. We'd also ask you to please register individually for each class so that we can be in touch with you ahead of time with any instructions, as we were earlier today with the Menti link for those of you who are with us on Zoom. So please do register. You can do so at stmarksnewcanaan.org. We're delighted this evening to have Dr. Jewelle Bickel as our presenter and instructor for this evening and for the next couple of weeks. Jewelle is my spouse, spoiler alert, and a member of St. Mark's here in New Canaan. Jewelle earned her PhD in philosophy at the University of Oklahoma, studying with Linda Zagzebski and others. In particular, she wrote her dissertation on intellectual virtue and the import of intellectual virtue theory for negotiating disagreements in real time. Currently, Jewelle is a lecturer in the humanities at SUNY Westchester Community College, as well as at Mercy College in Dobbs Ferry. We're delighted to have Jewelle with us. If we were in person, we would give her a round of applause, but for now, I'll hand it over to Jewelle.
Okay, thank you, everyone. It's really great to see everyone here. I'm going to get Menti up, and I just want to make sure everyone can see it. Maybe nod your head if the screen is now no longer my face and it says live, learn, love on it, possibly. Excellent. Okay, we're doing great. And thank you, people who have given me hearts in the corner to say that you made it to the Menti page. That always makes me feel much better about everything. So I'm really just so humbled to have you all here with me today. It makes me really hopeful for the future that there's other people out there who are wondering about like disagreement and trying to think about the ways in which we do it. I also apologize for last week's change. 2020 is such a funny year that we're excited to tell you, oh, it was just the stomach flu. Don't worry, it's just the stomach flu. It wasn't COVID, only in 2020 would we say something like that. So thank you again for your patience. So like Justin said, this site that I'm using is menti.com, and it allows for you to participate. So we can kind of get a sense of what everyone's thinking, even though we're not here in person. Usually I would just say, raise your hand if blah, blah, blah. So while I'm going to do a short introduction, I want you guys to think for a little bit about how likely you are. And here's a couple different thoughts. To always think you're right in disagreements, to always think you're wrong in disagreements, to run as far away as you possibly can from disagreements, or to start as many disagreements as you can. So just a little, let's get a sense of where we're at with our disagreements. And you can start doing that while I talk a little bit. So to start us off, I just kind of wanted to begin the class by giving a quick overview of what I'm going to present in the next 4 weeks. So you guys kind of have a sense of where we're going, why we're going there, all of that. I'm not an expert about disagreement, which I know will make many of you want to run. As my husband Justin could tell you, I actually don't like disagreements at all. I'm one of those run as far away from disagreements persons. But because of that, I ended up doing my dissertation on disagreements because I wanted to improve. I wanted to get better at them. And so I spent 3 years studying and thinking and reading about it, trying to figure out how to do disagreements. All right, so it looks like we've already got a few people joining. This is always fun when you see it change live on the screen. So we've got a lot of people who think they're pretty right in disagreements. Not surprised, that's kind of a good way to go. Some people who think they're wrong. We've got a lot of people who want to run from disagreements, which makes me feel very at home. Welcome, you're my people. And a few people who are like, let's get it started. We're gonna start all these disagreements. All right, we'll come back to this page in just a minute. So, right, live, love, learn. Let's do this. Becoming better at disagreements involves a couple of different things. Let me be clear. Disagreeing well is not going to look like being the world's most persuasive debater, nor is it going to look like just agreeing with everyone to keep the peace. Okay? Even if you are sort of the fiercest debater or most well-researched or an expert on a topic, you can still disagree poorly. On the other hand, disagreeing well is not just means simply getting along, right? It requires actually engaging with these issues of difference. You can't ignore the problem. I know we've all heard recently lots of calls for sort of civility in national discussions, and there's a place for that. But what I'm saying is not be nice to someone who thinks differently than you. I think I have a lot to say that's actually helpful for that. But what I'm saying is when you're disagreeing, we have to sort of focus on disagreeing well. And to disagree well is to have one thing in mind, okay? There's one goal of disagreeing well, and that is seeking the truth. So think for a minute about somebody who you know and you trust and you love and respect and who you generally think is probably as smart as you. You know, you guys usually agree on things. And then think about what happens when you disagree, that moment of disagreement. When you realize, wait, this person who I always agree with, we're not on the same page, right? It causes you a lot of sort of doubt, a lot of anxiety about, am I right? Am I wrong? What is the truth here? And so when we're doing this, talking about disagreements, we are doing this because we want to find the truth, right? Jesus reminds us the truth will set you free in John 8, and that's where we're going. So with the goal to find the truth, we need to figure out what kind of practices are going to help us reach this goal. And that's where I bring in the virtues. You're probably aware of some virtues, right? Honesty, loyalty, patience, yada, yada, yada. These moral virtues are, character traits that individuals have, which many ethicists would say, if that person has that trait and they use it, it's going to help them to do the right thing in given situations. For Aristotle, who's kind of the founder of this sort of way of thinking, virtues are habits of behavior, all right? How you tend to respond to particular situations. The thing about habits is once you get in the habit of doing something, it becomes sort of natural. You don't even think about it. So usually at this point, I'd say, hey, tell me one of your bad habits, but I'll give you one of mine instead. Procrastination, right? Procrastinating. Because it's become a habit for me, it is so hard to stop procrastinating. It's just natural. I don't even think about it. Aristotle wants to use that for his advantage. He wants you to become making good your habit. So you choose to do good and it becomes natural for you. So the same way, if you wanted to add going to the gym or spending less time on your phone, you had to practice this. Habits mean we practice them, which means we can cultivate virtue. We can become virtuous. We just have to practice at it. Now, intellectual virtues are really similar to moral virtues. Moral virtues, they're habits and they're practiced, and that's why we're doing this format, right? Of I talk for a little while, and then you guys are going to go home and work on your homework to practice these virtues. But whereas moral virtues help us to arrive at right action, intellectual virtues help us to arrive at true beliefs. So again, right, we're in disagreements. Why are we doing it? We want to seek the truth. Intellectual virtues will help us to get there. They're habits that if you have and you employ, you will more often than not arrive at the truth. So when I'm saying, I want you to disagree virtuously, I'm not saying just be nice. I'm saying, I want you to do things such that you will get towards the truth. Now, I realize many of you might be skeptical of virtues, i.e. Peter, and I get it. I used to be too. And it's easy to think, look, if I want the truth, shouldn't I just be smart? That would just make everything much easier than being open-minded or humble or whatever. And yeah, being smart's not going to hurt. But there are smart people in the world who still get things wrong. And many times this happens because they're not acting with intellectual virtues, okay? They might be making a hasty decision, or they're being careless in doing their math, or they're being arrogant about their beliefs. These sorts of things can cause us to come not to the truth. So the purpose of thinking with intellectual virtues is so we don't make those kinds of mistakes. Now, with regards to disagreement, I found that there are 3 key virtues that we want to think about. The first one is intellectual humility. Then we'll talk about fortitude and open-mindedness. Now, while I'm talking about these for a minute, I would like you guys to think about what comes to mind when you think of intellectual humility. So this thing will sort of make words bigger the more common they are, and the less common they are, make them smaller. So this is a way in which we can sort of get to know what people think of when they think of intellectual humility, as I kind of introduce these things. So 3 key virtues: intellectual humility, which I'm going to talk about in a second; intellectual fortitude, right? This is holding on to your belief when pressure is applied. Sometimes you should hold on to your beliefs. And so that's going to be important for disagreements. Open-mindedness, right, is being able to transcend where you're currently at, your position, in order to kind of take seriously the merits of another person's position. Being able to step out of what you think and think, okay, why would they think this? What is good about this position? That we're going to talk about that in 2 weeks. Now, in our final week, we'll talk about self-trust, which is going to help us figure out when we should do which one of these things. Okay, so, but right now we're just going to focus on the virtues and how to use them in disagreements. Okay, so far we've got Jesus, nice and bold. We got admitting wrong, curiosity, learning, conceding points. It changes so quickly, it's hard to keep up with. Gentleness, openness, deliberative. I like this. Kindness. So these are kind of things that come to mind when we think of the word intellectual humility. listening. I like that that one's nice and big. Very important. So let's talk about intellectual humility. Okay. Intellectual humility is kind of, it's similar to humility, right? So we think of humility as the virtue that's opposed to vanity. So intellectual humility then is opposed to intellectual egotism, right? It's the opposite of that. We all kind of know what intellectual egotism looks like, but it's harder to figure out what the opposite of that is. Now, it's tempting to think of intellectual humility as just, don't overestimate yourself, or just always, always agree with somebody else. And that's not quite right. When we're doing this, when we're talking about intellectual humility, we're talking about having the right disposition, sort of to believe responsibly. I really like that. I want to get bumper stickers that say that. I'm like TV shows and ads and all that. Believe responsibly. Believe responsibly given your particular relationship to the topic, okay? It's a topic you know a lot about. Sort of, you should be able to hold your belief a little firmer, right? If it's a topic you don't know a lot about, maybe you should be a little looser and be a little more willing to admit, I actually don't know much about this topic. So believe responsibly, make it a slogan. Intellectual humility is believing responsibly. It's knowing your limits in relationship to a topic. But more than that, it's acting in accordance with those limits, right? So I might know nothing about golf, which is very true. But if someone, asked me something about one of my very unjustified beliefs about golf, I could get really offended and be like, excuse me, I think blah, blah, blah. That would be a case of not acting with intellectual humility, because I know I don't know a lot about golf, but I still am sort of defending my my unjustified beliefs in golf anyways. So to get a really good full description of intellectual humility, it's basically proper attentiveness to one's intellectual limitations because you're motivated for an epistemic good, i.e. the truth, motivated by going for the truth. And this disposition is going to cause you to act in particular ways. Now, we should think about what this looks like actually in practice, right? Disposition to characteristically behave in a certain way is to take seriously your limits and believe in their negative impact. More often than not, that's going to mean admitting when you were wrong. So we all think about Benjamin Franklin and how smart he is, and has a sort of a full how wise and all that. But actually, when they were building the U.S. Constitution, he's sort of a perfect example of intellectual humility. So he says, I confess there are several parts of the Constitution which I do not at present approve, but I'm not sure I shall ever approve of them. But because I've sort of lived a long life, I have experienced many instances of being obliged by better information or fuller consideration to change opinions, even on important subjects. He goes on to say, ones which I thought I was right, but found out otherwise. The more apt I am to doubt my own judgment and to pay more respect to the judgments of others. So what Benjamin Franklin is asking for in this case, when people were trying to figure out, should we have the US Constitution or not, was people to just be willing to admit that they've been wrong. He admits, I'm likely to be wrong about some of these things, and because of that, I am sort of going with the majority. I'm thinking about what everyone else is saying in this case. Now, it's pretty obvious, I think, sort of why it's important to think of your limitations, cases of disagreements. Taking that seriously is going to really determine, how you would respond to a disagreement. Before I jump on, I just want to say intellectual humility is not going to be good enough, though. It's not sufficient. It doesn't help you sort of figure out how to judge somebody else's belief. Intellectual humility is all about your own belief. So it doesn't say like, well, is this person's belief good or bad? We'll do open-mindedness for that in 2 weeks. And it also doesn't do anything with your, intellectual strengths. It doesn't say, oh, look, you're being, arrogant about your belief in your knowledge of philosophy or something like that. it doesn't address that. But that's why we have intellectual fortitude next week to help us address that. So I've been talking for a while now about lots of things related to intellectual humility, but let's get down to it. What does it mean to practice intellectual humility in disagreements? Okay, I have 3 suggestions for you, 3 steps. Step number 1, be honest about what you know. Okay, and I'm sure you guys are thinking, wait, I am always honest. Like, I admit when I don't know anything about a topic, and I'm sure you guys probably are. But the problem is we live in such a world that we don't always even know how much we know about something, right? You think for a minute about all the times you've sort of thought about or talked with someone about the election in the past year. Can you even think of every person you've had a conversation with, every newspaper article, every news? There's so many of them, right? And so all of those have influenced your belief in some sort of way. So intellectual humility is saying, okay, how many of these are trustworthy sources? How many of these are just me listening to my cousin on Facebook? Which ones am I weighing appropriately? But intellectual humility is not just admitting like, well, okay, how much do I actually know? It's acting in accordance with how well you actually know a topic. So there's these really famous cases where they take people who disagree on a topic, something really controversial, abortion, capital punishment, and they take 2 people who disagree and they give them both the same literature, which has some agreeing and some disagreeing, points that kind of go on both sides. It's mixed information. And they have it read them, and then they ask them afterwards, what do you think? Now, most of us would think, okay, if you read lots of sort of stuff that sort of supports and disagrees with your point of view, you might be a little more, cautious in your belief. But we don't do that. Studies show over and over again that we actually become more polarized when we're faced with this evidence, right? We see that there's people who disagree with us, and it convinces us more and more that we're right. So instead of sort of thinking about what it means to disagree and being aware of our limitations or acting on those, we tend to sort of be like set in our ways. Okay, step number 2. This one's very important to me. No broad generalizations, no big sweeping claims, okay? You probably see this on social media or something all the time. People say, oh, such and such is true. And then someone else will respond, no expert thinks that. And then someone will be like, I'm an expert and I think this. And it goes on and on like this. Okay, we love to generalize. Makes our life much easier. And sometimes it works. But generalizations do not reliably work towards the truth. Okay, generalizations do not reliably seek the truth, which means they aren't really helpful for disagreeing well. So awareness of your limitations means also awareness of the limitations of generalizations, right? So if you're having a disagreement, please don't make broad sweeping statements about any sort of topic, right? If I say something like anyone who went to the University of Tennessee is a hillbilly, that's my husband's university, it's only going to take one person, one exception, to make me wrong. So generalizations are a very easy way to convince yourself that you know more than you actually know. Okay, 2. Step number 3. Do not assume you know someone else's beliefs. I want to strongly encourage you guys to have intellectual humility about how well you know what somebody else believes. Just like generalizing, we like to think we know what someone's intentions are. And we think, oh, you believe this, therefore you must be such and such person. You're a monster, blah, blah, blah. And sure, there are monsters. That's very true. But I think that you would be very wise to let the person you're talking to tell you themselves, I am a monster, before you go on thinking this is what they believe, right? To listen, to learn, and to love, what this class is called, requires you to sort of see the other person, see what they see in a belief. So they must find something compelling. if they believe this thing. And sure, it might have intellectual vices, right? They might be hasty or being closed-minded, but just because they are doesn't mean you're allowed to in a disagreement. Okay, if you really want to sort of seek to understand rather than be understood, it requires you to have some intellectual humility about how well not only do you know your own beliefs, but how well you know someone else's beliefs. Okay, so what does this mean? Let's get to the homework. Got 3 assignments for this week. Assignment number 1. I want you to think about someone who is a good exemplar of intellectual humility. So let me explain. In virtues, a lot of times we talk about exemplar, someone who is sort of a model at having particular behaviors, and how much easier it is sometimes to find someone who is good at behavior and then emulate them, right? So if I watch someone who played baseball very carefully, I could become good at baseball if I had any athletic ability. Similarly, if you watch someone who has intellectual humility and you see how they respond to things, you too can become more intellectually humble. So assignment number 1 is I want you to think about someone in your life who you know who is intellectually humble. Probably would look like them being willing to sort of accept when they've been wrong with grace and move forward, you know, admit, oh, my limitations, I actually don't know this topic as well as I was saying I was, something like that. So who do you know who's a good exemplar of intellectual humility? Second assignment, I want you to think about a time you were wrong in an argument. I know, what a wonderful thing to dwell on. A time you were wrong in an argument. When you think about this time you were wrong, I want you to think about whether there was an opportunity for intellectual humility at some point in time leading up to this disagreement, right? Was there sort of any kind of limitations you had that you maybe could have been aware of before the argument that might have helped prevent you from being wrong? Number 3, this is the practical one. In your disagreements this week, I want you to ask yourself 3 things. I want you to ask yourself, how well do I actually know this topic? All right. So if you're disagreeing with someone, take a moment to think, okay, how well do I know this? Also you know, are there any biases, anything like that? Am I acting in accordance with how well I know this topic? And finally, how well do I actually know my interlocutor's position? Am I assuming that I know someone's beliefs? So in your disagreements, ask yourself how well you know the topic, and that sort of will also imply, am I acting in accordance with how well I know this topic, or am I pretending to know, acting like I know more than I don't do? And then how well do I actually know my interlocutor's position? Okay, thank you guys.
Thank you so much, Jewelle. We have some time here for conversation between you all and Jewelle here. If you would, there are 3 different ways that you can participate and ask a question. You can pose a question in the chat, you can leave a comment on Facebook, or you can raise your hand using the raise hand function in Zoom. You can find that in your participants window. And while people have a chance to get started here, Jewelle, I wonder if I wonder who for you is an exemplar of intellectual humility, and perhaps while you're giving us your own intellectual exemplar, then others can think about their questions, allow them to percolate, and pose them in the chat or on Facebook Live, or raise your hand and they can speak to you.
Yes, that's a good question. So I think that my advisor, Linda Zadzinski, who I was working on with this project, I think I would think of her as an exemplar of intellectual humility. there is a lot that she knows, and she knows a lot. But she's also very willing to admit when she's been wrong, and to be convinced by another position. She will take seriously sort of somebody else's position and really reflect on it. And she doesn't sort of take her knowledge of anything to be so solid that she can't listen to anyone else's. So that would be mine.
That's really beautiful. Having had a small chance to get to meet Linda, true words, beautiful and holy thinker. We have a question here in the chat from Mickey Porta and Victor Alvarez, which is just asking you to say maybe a bit more, Jewelle, about what you mean by biases and being aware of biases. They're in that second step of the the third homework assignment. What do you mean by biases, and what are you?
Yes. So thank you for asking about that. So there's a lot of ways in which we kind of can convince ourselves easily that we're the truth. In particular, when we're talking about sort of how much do we know something. So I had a whole spiel about talking to you guys about this new movie that's come out, The Social Dilemma, that talks about sort of the ways in which Facebook and other things kind of purposely send you certain kinds of information in order to kind of cause you to kind of go further into whatever they believe your beliefs are. And so that was kind of what I had in mind when I was talking about the biases, was this way in which we kind of put ourselves in bubbles, and we actually aren't, maybe besides family members, we aren't actually in conversations often with people who we really disagree with, or reading sources that we disagree with. And so biases would include sort of being aware of that. It also includes being aware, like the belief polarization case that I mentioned, that, given evidence, you're more likely to be convinced you're right, even if the evidence is mixed, even if it's not clear. So thanks, Mickey. Great question.
Thanks. Jennifer DeLippi asks here, how can, what do you advise people do when they have deep emotional feelings about a topic that you may actually know quite a lot about, but you're still in an intense disagreement with somebody else?
Right.
What's the advice there?
So, I think that's really hard. We'll talk some next week about intellectual fortitude, about, things that you know a lot about, and holding on to those beliefs in time. I think that the deep emotional feeling part is something that we all need to be aware of. We'll talk about this in a few weeks too, but just being in these discussions, you might have sort of a very personal, deep feeling about this, but you also should note that the person you're discussing with might have one too. And so kind of just leaving it open so that we can have these moments. And I think even asking, what is this, what is this connection that you have? Or I have this feeling, I have this connection. I think that the more that you can sort of understand their position, and the more they can understand your position, the better the conversation is going to be, the more real it'll be.
Thanks, and thanks, Jennifer. Reverend Elizabeth has what I think is a pretty fantastic question. What do you do with something like a gut feeling? So that's something where you don't know enough, but enough to have a strong conviction about it. And the things of the gut, that's a kind of knowledge, but it is not be sufficient knowledge to be an expert. As you're saying. And Reverend Elizabeth is asking, maybe silence until you know more, or what sense would you make of it?
Right. No, I think that that's a really good question. I think a lot of times some of us do just have instincts about something, and want to hold those instincts. I don't think necessarily it's wrong to hold on to your beliefs, even if you don't have a lot of information about it. I would just say hold them loosely, right? So if you're presented with more information or something else that disagrees with your gut instinct, be willing to admit that, and be willing to say, okay, this is my gut instinct versus this and this source in some sort of way, which is, I know, really hard, but hold to believe responsibly sometimes is the believe loosely to allow yourself to be willing to be wrong about lots of things.
Thank you. And thanks to Reverend Elizabeth. I just want to note, Cindy Tai has a fantastic observation that sometimes it's difficult to find the real truth or truthful information in order to understand something. I think you were speaking to that just a bit of perhaps about the social dilemma, the fabulous documentary out there, which Cindy Tunham actually pointed to in the chat during your presentation too, Jewelle.
Oh, that's great. I didn't know that. It makes me feel like we're on the same page. I'm thrilled.
Yeah. And Suzanne Harrison has a question here. If you're someone who runs from disagreements, how should we tackle this week's homework? What advice do you have to your fellow disagreements?
Yes, run. No, I'm just kidding. I get you. I understand. The thing about disagreements is the more you practice them, the better you get. So sitting with someone and trying to disagree, it's going to be really hard at first, but if you do it a couple of times and you keep doing, sort of practicing these techniques or whatever, these practices, it will make disagreeing easier. I still don't like disagreeing. I really don't like it. Yet I lead classes on ethics where we talk about every controversial topic under the sun. And I've sort of been able to do that by practicing, a lot of practice on these things. So Suzanne, I would say find someone who you love and trust and, work on it. And I think giving yourself space too, right? You don't have to have all of your disagreement in one sitting. You can have some disagreement, you can walk away from it, you can come back, you can walk away from it, you can come back. You don't need to solve everything before dinner's over. So.
That's excellent advice. So I actually have a follow-up question there, Jewelle, and I'm going to pose it at the risk of inviting you to do something which you told us not to do, which is to traffic in generalizations.
Okay.
maybe I'll frame it this way. What do you think are the particular gifts and pitfalls of disagreements with family members in particular? If our folks here go to the dinner table, here in 5 minutes and try to do this with their spouse or with their kids or something like that, what advice do you have for them with family in particular? So, again, I know we're trafficking in generalizations here a little bit.
Yes. So I think that one of the things about disagreeing with family or close friends or anyone like that is the heightened emotions, right? What Jennifer was talking about in her question. When you're discussing this with someone who already have like a very intense emotional connection with, it's hard when you see that they believe something so different than you, right? This is that doubt. This is that how can someone who grew up the same world that I did come to this completely different conclusion? How are we so far apart? And so I think awareness of that emotional charge nature is really important for family discussions. I think that in particular, it's also easy to fall back to habits, so you have the same discussion every Thanksgiving. And, this Thanksgiving is going to be different. This Thanksgiving, we're going to do all these things. But like habits are, they're really, they're hard to break. And so being very conscientious and being very aware of these things. And I think personally, I would suggest taking lots of breaks, time to reflect and come back on these discussions. Beautiful.
Thank you. Emily Schneider has a great question here. How do you recommend using personal experience for a discussion, especially when that personal experience might be different from the bird's eye view or the 100-foot view of a topic or a current event? What role does personal experience play?
Yes, so I think personal experience is important. I think it's how many of us come to many of our beliefs is through how we've experienced something, what we've done. And I think it can play a role. Again, it's important. It's part of the decision. It just can't be everything, right? So that's kind of going to be my theme over and over again. It's like everything kind of needs to be weighed together. So I think that in discussions with people, you can and you should be like willing to say, well, I have this personal experience. But because I have this personal experience doesn't mean that you have that personal experience, right? So we have to sort of hold it loosely, that this is my experience and that's very important to me, but maybe you've had something slightly different in your life, something along those lines.
Thanks. So if, if this week we're trying to practice intellectual humility in our disagreements, what happens if we're in a disagreement with somebody who thinks they're always right about everything? So, there's asymmetry here in the virtue calculus. I'm trying to be intellectually humble, but the other person is like the opposite of intellectually humble. I suppose that's not a very humble thing to make that analysis. But let's
say that about them. Yeah, no.
Think about what Cindy Tai has said here in the chat, and also, Stephanie Johnson has said the goal isn't to win every disagreement, but we can remember that sometimes we just agree to disagree, which I think is great advice always. But what if the other person actually is out to win the disagreement, for example? How do you just keep from getting run over?
Yes, so I think that is maybe one of the biggest challenges when it comes to practicing these things is if your interlocutor, the person who you're talking with, is not on the same page. If they are out to win, it can be very challenging to seek the truth because you guys have two separate goals. You have two different ways of thinking about disagreements. It depends on their level of what they're doing. If they're kind of like trolling, if they're not even really trying, I think there's various ways to kind of disengage or whatnot. I think that one thing I might do would be ask them more about their beliefs, right? So they're the win, so they're shutting down anything you say. And so this would be a moment to kind of get to understand how they believe things better. And so ask them questions about that in a way that might encourage them to talk more honestly and a little less like gladiator style. And from asking sort of them about their point of view, then find the opening to say, okay, so here's why I think what I think in relation to that.
So a similar question here in the waning moments. And if somebody is anxious to get a last word in, please do raise your hand or type something into the chat really quickly here because we're coming to the end of our time. Jennifer DeLippi again asks, what do you do when somebody starts a disagreement, provokes one, but then goes silent? So that's a particular kind of trolling. How would you handle that kind of asymmetry where you're not on the same page, you're on the same goals of seeking the truth?
So I think that is challenging. I think that in those cases, you can sort of say, here's what I think, here's why I think. But if they have disengaged, it's going to be really hard to kind of engage them without beating them on the head with what you think. And so I'd say give them time and say, okay, you don't want to talk about this right now. Can we talk about this in a week or something along those lines? Especially if it's family. I can see that this is maybe hard for you to talk about now. You brought it up, but I really would like to talk about this in a future time. So is that possible? I think that would be my method. I know some people are, they're going to go silent and they're going to disengage and they're going to run. I used to do that. And it just requires patience with them because eventually they'll want to come back. It just depends on how long, So yes, those are my thoughts.
Thank you so much. We are at the end of our time here because we want to keep this as brief as possible so that you guys can go and have dinner and maybe even begin to practice your homework for this next week.
Disagree well.
Yeah, go disagree well. Again, you guys are thinking about who might be an exemplar of intellectual humility in your life. You're thinking also about when were you wrong in an argument, and was there a chance for intellectual humility that you passed up on the way to that? And then the last is to practice intellectual humility in real time by engaging in a disagreement where you're asking yourself, how well do I actually know the topic? Am I biased in any way in this conversation? Am I acting in accordance with how well I actually know the topic or don't? And how well do I know my interlocutor and their beliefs and where they're coming from? We will email these 3 homework prompts for you guys. If you've registered for the class, for tonight's class on our website, we're going to email those 3 to you here in just a couple of minutes so that you've got them right there in front of you in case you didn't scribble down the notes. God bless you all. Dr. Bickel, we're so happy.
Thank you guys so much for coming. I really appreciate it. You had great questions, and I look forward to next week and talking about this with you guys.
God bless you all. Good night.